Yeah, so we have wild berries as our talk tonight. I think what I'll do is probably just share my screen and go right into that. And Caroline and Dinny and I were talking before most of you came on, just saying that I'll do my best to go through the presentation as quickly as possible, and then if you have some questions, I can do that afterwards. Sound good? Yep. Okay. Okay, does that show up okay for everyone?
Yes.
All right, great. Okay, so native berries. There's lots of different species that we can grow here, and a lot of them are actually pretty conducive to being in your backyard or even in patio planters. So I thought what I'd do is just go through a few reasons as to why you might want to grow wild berries, some of the most common species around here that you could grow, and then some sort of pointers at the end. And maybe it might be easiest if we save questions till the end. So make yourself some notes, and if you really can't resist and you have to say something in the middle, that's okay too. But I'll let Denis or Caroline unmute you because I don't have these powers. So wild and wonderful growing backyard berries. Why should we consider growing backyard berries or wild berries, sorry, in our backyard instead of some of these more cultivated varietals? One, they were here first. I think it is actually a good reason. And I think it's important to grow native species, whether they're berries or other native plants. It's important for our native pollinators, and it's important for our ecology. Our native berries are generally hardy and easy to grow. They tend to need less help than some of the fussier cultivars that you can get at the garden center. I think that they have some pretty extraordinary flavor to them. For example, compare a wild strawberry to what we get in the store, which comes from California and looks massive and doesn't taste like anything. Nutritional and medicinal values as well. A number of our native species have high levels of phytochemicals in them. So those are chemicals like anthocyanins, which are pigments, which tend to have anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer. There's lots of beneficial reasons for your health to be eating native berries. Wildlife value. There are other critters, sometimes bears, which you might not want in your yard, but certainly birds and some of the smaller mammals do appreciate some of these native species, and you can encourage and support them with these. General wildlife value and also ornamental value. I was in a florist the other day and they had not just the usual salal leaves that you would expect to see, but they also had some red huckleberry stems, and it was in the winter and they were green stems with these ugly little pink buds on them. So there is definitely an ornamental value to some of these. Berries are the most widely used and recognized wild plant food resource that we have in British Columbia today. There, lots of people will go and pick mushrooms, but there are far more people that will pick berries and actually recognize a berry and feel safe to eat a berry. I'm sure you'll find in your mushroom talk there are some toxic ones and some new introductions like the death cap that we have to be very careful of. So native berries can be very easy to identify, and there's not a lot of ones that you can go wrong with. Something that is, we'll cover a couple of poisonous species here, and the ones that are poisonous tend to tell you that they're poisonous. They tend to taste really nasty or be very bitter. So you as a mammal are not the desired vehicle for those fruit. I just love this slide. So a lot of traditional foods like wild berries are good for you. And I love that this fellow is 100, well, this is a while ago now, so he's gone, but he's 112. And I love that his wife is so much younger at 88. And in this article that I took the photo from, he talked about how eating mostly traditional foods is what he attributed to the longevity of his life, not really eating any processed foods. So summertime here in British Columbia, we have an extraordinary diversity of berry species in our province. We have about 40 to 50 different kinds of native berries and fruit, which really is extraordinary. There are a lot of dietary contributions from native berries. Vitamin C and A are pretty obvious ones. Iron and other essential nutrients, some carbohydrates, but not a lot. It's a lot of dietary fiber and flavor. Native berries really are a special treat. And as I mentioned earlier, there are these sort of nutraceutical or medicinal benefits, such as antioxidants, tannins, anthocyanins, etc. So if anyone's on the turmeric craze that people seem to be on at the moment, it's the anthocyanins, the pigments, curcumin, especially in turmeric, that is very medicinal and anti-inflammatory. If you look at this map of the biogeoclimatic zones of British Columbia, it really helps you understand what an extraordinary province we're privileged to live in. All those different colors indicate different zones, and within those, though, there are subzones within each classification. And when I look at that, I just see a lot of different berry species, because that again is an extraordinary complexity of ecosystems within what's on the global scale, a relatively small area. So what are the best berries for us to grow here on the South Coast? When I was writing the field guides for Lone Pine, I introduced what I call the scale of edibility, because you can find berries that look wonderful and taste terrible. Others don't look so great, but they taste amazing. Some are, just mildly palatable. Others are downright not nice to eat, but they're not going to harm you, and they are edible. And you'd want to know what those were in a survival situation. One of my sidelines to pay for my farming habit is I work as a consultant in the survival industry. So I've worked, last fall I was away for 2.5 months paying off the work that had to be done on my irrigation dugout. So I was working for the producers of Alone and Naked and Afraid for a new show that just came out last 2 weeks ago. It's called Chef versus Wild. So if you want something entertaining to watch, I can tell you that reality TV is definitely a misnomer. There's a lot of stuff that happened behind the scenes to make that one happen. Another show that I work on that you might enjoy even more actually is called Wild Harvest. And the premise is Les Stroud, who is Canadian from Ontario, and he had a television show for a long time called Survivor Man that you might have heard of. And in this show, we're just starting to film season 3 now, and he goes out with our friend Paul Rogowski, who's a 4-star chef from Calgary. Les forages some wild ingredients such as berries, and then Paul's challenge is to make those into a gourmet meal, nicely presented, that anyone could do in an average kitchen. So Wild Harvest, and I think there's still some episodes up on YouTube. So scale of edibility, very important, but also, it is good to know some of these wild berries in case you do go on a hike and you get lost and you end up being out longer, even overnight, than you anticipated. And it's good to know what the poisonous ones are too. So scale of edibility, habitat requirements, something like a red huckleberry really prefers a moist environment rather than something that might do better in a rocky, dry outcrop. Ones that are easy to grow, and of course the tasty ones. Salal is, so we'll just go through a number of the species that I think are good candidates. Salal, you've probably all seen it if you're around Vancouver. If you go up the North Shore Mountains, it's all quite a common understory in the forest. It's an evergreen shrub. It's got leathery oval leaves. You probably all recognize it as well from floral bouquets. It can grow up to 1.5 meters, sometimes even 2 meters tall. It's got urn-shaped flowers, which look a bit like heather. So they're sort of bells pointing downwards. The berries are a dark blue purple color. They are sweet and juicy. They really vary a lot depending on where that particular plant is growing. So if you've tried salal berries and you don't think you like them, I would encourage you to keep sampling, because they can taste quite different even a few meters apart from each other. Common understory plant. And it does spread through underground roots, so it can get a little invasive in the right conditions. It has a very high anthocyanin content. There's a fellow at UVic in the School of Forestry, in chemistry. I can't remember. Anyway, it's Peter Constable, and he and some of his grad students did some research a few years ago, and they were looking at anthocyanin, which is the pigment, so it's got most of the health benefits of salal. And of any fruit studied around the globe, except for some obscure persimmon in northern China, the salal had the highest level of known of anthocyanin. And that makes it makes sense to me too, because indigenous people used it as a pigment, as a paint. Thimbleberry, which is in the rose family. If you look at the flowers, you can recognize that. Large maple-like leaves, not to be confused with devil's club, which also has large maple-like leaves, but they're covered in nasty spines. Thimbleberry makes excellent toilet paper if you get lost in the woods. Devil's club does not. So you've got those white flowers, and you've got very fine-grained, but juicy, edible red berries. I really like thimbleberries. Some people find them a bit grainy or crunchy, but I just really love the flavor. They're like an intense raspberry. And again, like salal, it spreads through underground roots, and it can get invasive if you're not careful. Traditionally, thimbleberry shoots were eaten as a spring vegetable along with salmonberry shoots. And if you see them growing this spring coming up, if you just reach out and try and snap them, so this one you would snap sort of around here. If they're nice to eat, they snap off quite easily. If you bend this and it just keeps bending and it doesn't snap, then you probably want to leave that one. The other thing that I do is when I'm harvesting from the wild, I really try and prune the plant. So I use principles, the same that I do here at the farm. So instead of just ripping this whole shoot out or cutting it right at the base, I would find a good looking leaf like this one. I'd follow back to the stem and I would cut just above that. So I'm not killing that stem back completely. And in fact, with some species, that's a good pruning to do because it encourages much more new growth at the base. There's some berries there. It probably isn't the best photo. Whoops. Sorry, seeing if I could zoom it, but it's not going to. Yeah, the red ones here are the ones that are really ripe. Nootka rose. It's the most common species of wild rose that we find on the coast here. We do have a number of other native ones like the bald hip rose. It has very large showy flowers. It can form these very dense thickets. So again, it can get a bit invasive in your garden if you're not careful. And we eat the petals in the springtime. They're lovely in salads. And if you have just a mild vinegar, like a white wine vinegar, and you put the petals in it, it can make a very nice salad dressing. If you let the flowers go through and you harvest the hips in the fall, harvesting them after it started to get a bit cold, they'll be a bit sweeter. Sugar is a natural antifreeze. So a lot of fruit that lasts well into the winter, like evergreen huckleberry or the rose hips of Nootka rose, they will actually get sweeter when it gets colder. So you can do jellies, you can do syrups, you can just snack on them. The one caution is when you open them up, the seeds inside are surrounded by a kind of a furry hair that is a bit like fiberglass. So you want to make sure that you scrape that out. If you have any children or grandchildren, or maybe grandchildren in your life, it makes great itching powder. Low Oregon grape grows quite close to the ground. And the purple berries are edible. They're very high in anthocyanins, again, those pigments that have health benefits. They're very tart and tangy, so most people find them a bit much just to eat them straight off the plant. I really like a jam that is salal mixed with Oregon grape. I find that has the perfect mix of the sweetness of the salal and the zing of the Oregon grape. They're one of the first plants to flower in the springtime. So if you have a garden where you're trying to encourage native pollinators, this is a very good choice, both the low and the tall Oregon grape. Traditionally, the bark of these species were used in medicine to regulate blood sugar levels in particular, and also as a liver tonic, as it's a bitter compound. And they're very drought resistant as well. Salmonberry prefers to be in a moister area. Up north, they talk about spring starting when the salmonberries come out around the Bella Coola Valley. The sort of English translation of the traditional name there for spring is salmonberry blossoms. So that indicates the change in the season. Does prefer moist ground. You can eat the shoots in the same way that you can with the thimbleberries in the early spring. And the berries are quite interesting too, because you'll note down here that they're all different colors. Those are all ripe. And it's very unusual in a fruit to have multiple colorations indicate the same stage of ripeness. Normally, if this was an average kind of berry, these sort of lighter colored yellow ones would be not very ripe. The orange would be riper. The red would be more riper than that. And this dark one would probably indicate a perfectly ripe fruit. But salmonberries aren't like that. They've got this interesting phenology in them. And again, it's one of these ones like the thimbleberry and the rose that it spreads through some tough underground roots. And so it can take over if you're not careful. We have 6 native blueberry species in British Columbia. Oval leaf blueberry, Alaska blueberry is also very popular. And blueberries can be a little trickier to grow because they do prefer acidic and moist soil. The foliage in the fall can be quite decorative. It's a very red color when the nights get cold. Blueberries, as you know, are high in antioxidants, although they are not even a fraction as high as salal. And you can get some pretty good production off of a native blueberry plant. Excellent flavor, of course. And a lot of these berry species respond quite well to basic cultivation techniques, whether it's a bit of fertilizer, watering, pruning, weeding, compost around the roots. Soapberry has a very distinctive flavor. It's quite bitter, so it's traditionally people would have it with ulican grease. Sometimes they put something like salmonberry or salal juice in it to sweeten it a bit. But it wasn't traditionally eaten as a very sweet thing. Nowadays it is, so people sprinkle sugar into it. And because of the saponins in it, the juice from the fruit just whips up into this thing that people still call Indian ice cream. It's pretty common in open forest areas, Gulf Islands, South Coast, and up in the interior, you get it a lot more than down here. It doesn't like dense forest. It likes more sort of clearing open areas. And here you can see a close-up of the stem in the second photo here, and it's got sort of almost like a brown scale on it. And the leaves were drunk as a tea, as a sort of general health tonic. There's an example of soapberry ice cream. So in modern times now, people will jar the berries. Sometimes they'll just freeze them. This is a spatula that could be used to whip it, or sometimes people would use a big basket and salal berry leaves and hold those together as a bundle and use it like a whisk. And it does whip up really quickly. Evergreen huckleberry is also a delicious berry. You see it quite often in landscaping now around sort of residential buildings, commercial buildings. It's quite common. What gets me is it can have just an incredible fruit set on it, and people just walk by and they don't realize that it's edible. Next time you're in Vancouver, if you go down to the museum here downtown, the landscaping all around the edges is full of these, and sometimes you can go down and pick a big pail and nobody even notices. There are 2 main variations within evergreen huckleberry, and Western science only recognizes one, but in the coastal indigenous languages here, people often recognize both of these. So this one has the more common phenotype of just a glossy blackish berry. This one looks a bit more like a commercial blueberry, which got that bit of a bloom on it. And I do tend to find that these ones are a bit sweeter. There was in 2011, for whatever reason, we had just an extraordinary harvest of evergreen huckleberries here. And some of them look like tropical plants where the fruit will grow directly off the stem and you can barely see any leaves. So imagine whole bushes that looked like this. It was fabulous. It lives on in my berry dreams. Saskatoonberry. On the coast here, they can grow well. They aren't as common now, and the berries tend to be a bit mealier and be more prone to getting bugs in them now that they're not being cultivated. So when you have them in your yard, you can look after them so you get better fruit. As soon as you go up above Whistler into the Pemberton Valley, I was up there this summer, and even driving down the side of a road, these large shrubs looked like they were in someone's fine tended orchard. It was unbelievable, the clusters of fruit that this plant can produce. So I think Saskatoons are a wonderful addition to a garden. They do flower quite early, and the pollinators love them as well. And on the coast here, we used to have a lot more of them, but Indigenous people burned and pruned and tended them, and that hasn't happened generally for a while now. So you can still find some very old shrubs, but they don't tend to produce very well. It's an example that's on some birch bark. Highbush cranberry is another of these berries that we perhaps don't have as much of a taste for because of its bitterness, but it does make excellent jams and jellies. It sets like a rock, and it prefers a moister habitat. It can get quite tall, sort of 3-4 meters easily. And in the springtime, it has these beautiful white umbels of flowers, which the pollinators really like. And in the winter, or in the fall, sorry, the leaves will change to a reddish color, which is quite pretty. And then once they drop off, you often have the red berries left, which can be very decorative. And the birds will get them, of course. Red huckleberry, if you're from North Vancouver, of course, you've got lots of them in places like Lynn Valley, and very common here on the island as well. It'll often grow on old stumps because in the summer months, those, as they're decomposing, will have more moisture in them. And our coastal soils tend to be very poor here because it is a high rainfall environment. So this species is quite adapted to growing into dead old trees because it can pull nutrients from that decaying wood. Blackcap raspberry. Again, you get quite a lot of it on the North Shore. It's very easy to grow from seed, and the branches grow in these big, long sprays, and it responds very well to some basic cultivation. Again, some pruning, some fertilize, a bit of water. They really are delicious. They melt in your mouth a bit more than a raspberry does. And it is a tough plant. You can ignore this completely and it's still going to do quite well. It has recurved spines on it, so they're sort of curved up rather than a spike. And what that means is it's a bit like a cat. You know, if your cat climbs on your lap and you don't want it and you sort of pull it off, and all that does is cause its claws to go like that. That's the same thing with blackcap raspberries. So in the ones that we grow here as a seed crop at my farm, we have them tied up on the fence so that they don't catch your ankles when you're going past. Pacific crabapple is our only native apple here on the coast. And the fruit are really, they're quite small. And again, similar to the evergreen huckleberry, Western science only recognizes one, which is Pyrus fusca. But Indigenous groups, particularly in the BC Central Coast, recognize 4 or even 5 different kinds of what they call molks. And the fruit have very different shapes, from sort of rounder, almost like an ornamental crabapple, to these more conventional ones that you see in the photo. They do have some spines on them, a bit like a hawthorn spine. The wood is very tough. It was used for carving things like spoons. And really the best flavor of this fruit is after the first frost. And when you see bunches of them, they'll look, if you see this one is a little browner, that one's a little yellower, that's tending towards brown, but this is really better. So after a frost, they'll look quite brown and you'll think, oh, they're going rotten. They're not yet. So that is actually the best time to pick them. And what people used to do is pick them when they were more sort of in this stage, and then they would put them into bentwood cedar boxes and cover them with some water and then some oolican oil or something on the top to seal it all in. And then they'd put them on storage platforms or bury them in storage boxes in the ground inside their big houses, and those would mature slowly over the fall and winter, and then they would be taken out as a huge treat in feasts. They're a very sharp, tangy vitamin C type flavor, and you can imagine if you're having fish and other more protein-based foods, this is really a valuable flavor enhancer to those, and very high in vitamin C. And if you pick them then, it also stops the bears from getting them. So these ones are not very ripe. This one here, it's going darker. Those have been hit by a bit of frost. You can also see the leaves are starting to change color. And even today, people will still enjoy them making jam, that kind of thing. This is up the Central Coast in Hartley Bay. And this is a bowl of Pyropia abache, which is called red laver or black laver on the coast here. And it's one of our native seaweeds that is a cousin of the Japanese nori that you use in sushi. So it's very tasty and very good for you. Seaweeds is another talk we could do because there's so many good seaweeds on the coast here. Bunchberry is related to dogwood. It's a Cornus species, and you can recognize it here. A dogwood, it's interesting that it's our native flower of British Columbia, because these are not actually petals. These are actually a sort of adapted leaf form, and the flower itself is this, which is pretty drab and not very interesting, but there you go. Our provincial flower is actually an adapted leaf. The bunchberry fruit, again, like the red huckleberry, they really do prefer moist habitat, especially old rotting stumps. And you can see this is a pretty good collection of berries here. They're not that nice if you cook them. I like them just as a fresh trail nibble. They don't have a very strong flavor, but I like the texture. They're kind of spongy and then they're crunchy in the middle. And they're very decorative. And they're also shade plants. So if you have an area in your garden that's perhaps a bit moist and harder to get a ground cover established, that would be a good choice. Red elderberry, those can grow very tall, like sort of 4 to 5 meters. On the coast here, we have red elderberry, and then we also have a blue elderberry, and they're equally decorative, pretty plants. You can make a cordial from the flowers in the springtime. And if you've heard of elderflower cordial or elderflower pressé, elderflower syrup is quite nice as well. And then if you don't eat all the flowers, then you get the fruit at the end of the summer. The red elderberries are slightly toxic, but that is the cyanic glucosides that are in them are neutralized with a bit of heat. So cooking them neutralizes that. I ate so many of these as a kid, I never felt sick, but they do say that you shouldn't eat too many of them raw. Elderberry again. With a stink bug, watch out if you see these guys, because they are pretty nasty if you bite into one of those by accident. Indian plum is not really a plum, and it has a huge seed inside of it. So you would never really want to make them into jam, but I include them here because they make quite a nice trail nibble. And it's one of the earliest native plants to flower here on the coast. Has these sort of cascades of delicate little white flowers. So it's great for the hummingbirds and pollinators early in the season. And it is one of the first fruit that we get here to ripen on the coast. And it's not thorny, and it doesn't spread through underground roots like Thimbleberry does. So it's a very well-behaved plant. Arbutus, I think, could use all the help that they could get right now. They are on the most northern extent of their range in southern British Columbia. Mostly they're in California, Oregon, some in Washington. So we're really on the edge of their range here. They were a bit of a canary in the coal mine. Even 20 years ago, they were starting to suffer from a number of different fungal diseases that are really a result of the plants getting stressed. So they don't like these extremes of climate that we're starting to see, you know, the cold, wet winters, the flooding, the extended drought in the summer months. So there's 3 different funguses or fungi that are attacking them at the root, the leaf, and the cambium level. So if you have the opportunity to plant one in your yard, I would, because eventually there's going to be a seed that grows that is not going to be as, it's going to produce a plant that's not as susceptible to these different fungi. And if it's in your garden, you can help look after it too, which will make it more robust and resilient. And the orange fruit are quite sweet. I like nibbling on them. Trailing blackberry, it's in the 5% of flowering plant species that have a male and female plant on different individuals. So you do need to have a number of them in order to get fruit in your garden. And they both have these lovely white flowers on them, so it's a bit hard to tell which one's which unless you look closely. And as I mentioned here, the trailing blackberry is one of the parents of a number of our modern cultivar Rubus sort of vining berries on the coast here, with cascade berry being one example. I thought it would be good if we looked at poisonous berries. And when my kids were younger, they're 17 and almost 19 now, I did face a bit of pressure from other parents, because I actually encouraged my kids to eat things that I knew were poisonous in a controlled environment. If you just tell your kids about dangers that are over there, and you don't either let them have some experience with it, or you just forbid them to talk about it, you actually don't keep them safe at all. So we would eat things like, well, we'd taste, we wouldn't eat. So something like a snowberry, or even something like Western yew, Pacific yew, which is a very toxic plant. And the idea was the kids would try it. I would show them how to do that, and then spit it out, rinse your mouth out and spit a couple of times again. And so it's not going to hurt you. And you actually know what these fruit or these poisonous plants taste like. The exception to that is poison hemlock, because that is so poisonous, you wouldn't even want to eat some of it. But that's very distinctive with it. It's the purple splotches on the stem, and it has a very strong acrid smell. You wouldn't want to eat it. But snowberries are poisonous. Devil's club berries, also very bitter, nasty tasting. You, as a mammal, well, as a human, you are not the desired vehicle to take the seeds from this parent plant and pick them and then go somewhere else and deposit them with a pile of fertilizer. That's bears, that's birds, but not humans. And when you taste this fruit, you know that the plant is telling you to back off. You don't have the digestive tract that these seeds will do well coming out the other end. Pacific yew is one of the most toxic plants that we have on the coast here, but it's also an extremely important plant. It was the source of Taxol, which was really the first drug that we had to treat ovarian and breast cancers. Again, it's in the 5% of flowering plants like the trailing blackberry, where you have the individuals on male and female on individual plants. And the mnemonic that I use when I'm teaching my students how to not eat this plant by accident, because it does look fairly similar to Western hemlock, for example, which has lots of polyphenols, vitamin C, and other things that would be good for you to have in a tea, especially around winter cold season. And so one of the things that I teach my students when I am showing them yew versus hemlock or Douglas fir, for example, is each of these little needles here, you can't, it's too hard to see it in this photo, sorry, but each of these have just a tiny little spike on the end of them. So what I tell them is, you don't want to eat this. So YOU or YEW, you don't want to eat this, or needles will hurt you. So if you're hiking in the woods and you come across a conifer and you're not sure if it's a yew or not, if you look, you'll see that little hypodermic needle at the end of it. And as I say on my slide here, this really is one to watch for, because drinking as few as 50 needles can kill the average size man. So it has alkaloids and taxanes in it that will actually paralyze your heart muscle. Interestingly enough, the berry is edible. It's like it's an aril, so it's a little cup, and then the seed sits in it like this. So you can eat the berry, but be careful, because the seeds, about 3 seeds will kill an average sized man. That was, I didn't do the research, but, and you have to chew them for that to work. So those are a number of species that are easy to grow in your backyard, and a number of poisonous ones that perhaps you want to be aware of, but maybe not grow in your backyard. And I thought it would be useful to look at what wild berry plants actually need to thrive. And it is pretty basic. First of all, you should start with quality and disease-free plants. So if you're buying them from a nursery, you should look at whether the tissue is healthy or not. Does it look like it has some disease on the stem? Are there leaves that are dying and other ones that look healthy? So look for a quality disease-free plant. If you're wild harvesting, be responsible and ethical about how you're doing it. So for example, if you go up into some clear cuts and you're looking maybe to harvest some plants, the side of the road would be a good place to do that, as long as you're not going to get hit by a car coming along, because a lot of those plants are going to be mown down anyway by the highway crews. And if I'm harvesting plants in the wild, I'll often thin it out. So I'll look for a patch maybe that's self-seeded and it's very dense, and I'll pull out a few so that the ones that I'm leaving behind have a better chance to do well than if they had grown so tightly together. If it's a species at a time of year where maybe they're quite dormant and I have the opportunity to do some propagation, I'll do that as well as a thank you to the species. So for example, if you're digging up some salmonberry roots and there's some other roots at the same location, you could dig up a section, so thin it out, and then take a few little root cuttings that probably have some roots on them themselves. And as you're hiking back down the trail, just look for habitat that you think that salmonberry might do well in, fairly moist or shaded, and plant those little roots out as you go along. And that way you've taken what you wanted, but you've done it in a way that's left that population healthier and more robust than if you hadn't come along and taken what you wanted. Light is important to consider. Something like a bunchberry doesn't necessarily want a lot of light. They'll do okay in a sunnier area, but they really do prefer a shade habitat. Look at the kind of soil for that particular species. As I mentioned, blueberries like a moist, acidic soil. Something like a salmonberry likes it very moist as well, but something like Saskatoon would probably do better in a dry area. How much water is that particular species going to need? What kind of shelter? Some fruiting species do much better when they're not subjected to heavy blustering winds, for example. And then just a basic bit of pruning and care. So now that you've gone out and to your garden and you're growing these native species. Does anyone remember what these are? Remember there's two variants? Denny, you're probably the only one who's not muted. No, you are muted.
Actually, anybody can unmute themselves if they
Oh,
want.
it's the huckleberry, the
The evergreen huckleberry.
green huckleberry, yeah.
And you can see in this basket the two variants that you get, the glossy dark fruit and then the lighter sort of almost like a bloom on it. That was 2011 in the epic evergreen huckleberry year. So very easy recipes. The first one is just eat them fresh as you're walking along. There's a ton of these kind of berries all over Stanley Park. And that's probably a good place to go and forage around. And again, you can give thanks by when you pick some fruit to eat as you're walking down the trail, you know, pick some extra ones, keep it in your hand, and then just stick the berry seeds in the dirt and start to propagate those species. That's Hayden, he's almost 19 now. Recipe number 2, you can just freeze them. This is with some of my students at Bamfield at the Marine Station, and we made crabapple puree and then we froze it. We had salmon berries and then some salal berries, and we froze them all and then defrost. Well, we took them out and made sort of like just a wild berry sorbet that was just wild berries, and it was really very tasty and it looked great. You can make a basic jam out of native berries. I quite often will just pick as I'm hiking and then I'll throw all the fruit in a pot when I get home. So this has thimbleberries, red huckleberry, salmonberry, there's some salal, that's a bog cranberry. Oh, and these are bunch berries in here too. Then you can add an equal amount of sugar and fruit. You could add a lot less sugar if you don't mind it being a soft sort of compote rather than a jam. And that's actually my preference. I find a lot of jams that are a perfect set, so they're hard, they're way too sweet. Because jams set as a result of a chemical reaction between pectin, acid, and sugar, and you do need a lot of sugar to do that. And so if you put your fruit and sweeten to taste, you can put it in a pot on a medium burner and then making sure that you use a flat bottom spoon so you're scraping the bottom of the pan so it doesn't stick and burn. You can just keep scraping it and stirring it, and eventually it cooks down. You can, I mean, I grew up in the bush, so you know we weren't using lots of recipes, and my mom used to just throw more acidic fruit like green crab apples or a bit more sugar in it, and until things set. So you know it's a bit more like alchemy than a recipe, but it will eventually work. So that's what I'll often do when I'm making jam with native berries. I'll muck about with the different proportions, and sometimes I get it to set, and other times it just reduces into a compote. It's not hard to do, and the results, honestly, most people are pretty ecstatic with it. It's hard to mess it up. So once you have boiled your fruit up with your sugar, you've reduced it perhaps to turn it into more of a compote, then put them into clean hot jars and seal them shut. You can also make a basic fruit leather with native berries. Again, I usually just go for a hike and pick a bunch of them and cook them down. We usually add a little bit of sugar because as stuff dries, it tends to be less sweet. And traditionally, the way that you would, that's one of my students, is a bit more sour than she was expecting. Traditionally, people would use skunk cabbage, which is an interesting choice because skunk cabbage itself is toxic. It has calcium oxalate crystals in it, which are very nasty, but it doesn't tend to come out in the food. So it was used as, some people call it, even today they call it Indian wax paper, because you can wrap things like fish in it in a traditional pit cook and it won't go out, like the flavor or the calcium oxalate won't go out into your food. So traditionally, if you want to do more of that kind of a recipe, you can boil the berries up and then spread them out in a sunroom or on your garden in a warm area to dry. And what you would do is peel it up once it's started to dry and then flip it over again. But you can also do that in a baking sheet in your oven. Making any kind of berry cordial is very easy. So take your fresh wild berries, again, ideally not the red elderberries because those do need cooking. Put it into a glass jar and mash it lightly, and then take a pickling vinegar. So I quite like using like a cider vinegar because it's not as strong tasting. And that's what we use for pickling as well. So you take your berries, and they could be non-native berries like Himalayan blackberries. Those are delicious, and the more fruit, of course, that you pick of those, the less seeds are eaten by the birds to be spread around. So, for example, if you took salal berry or blackberry, you put them into something like a mason jar, and then just ever so slightly mash them, not too much, and then add enough vinegar so that it covers the fruit just by about that much. And then put a lid on it. When I do something like this, I leave it on my kitchen counter because then I remember to shake it every day or so. And you can leave it there for 1 or 2 weeks, then strain the liquid out through a cheesecloth, and then heat the juice. Say you have a cup of juice, then put a cup of sugar with it until the sugar dissolves on the burner. And then again, you can pour it into sterilized jars and seal it. This is what's called a shrub cordial. And traditionally, shrubs were used as digestives and also have a number of health benefits because a lot of the active compounds, whether it's vitamin C or anthocyanins within the berries, are preserved this way. Vitamin C will denature if you cook it too much at too much of a temperature. So using vinegar as a way to preserve your fruit with sugar maintains a lot more of the health benefits of the fruit than if you boiled it. And I think, yeah, I think maybe we'll leave it at that. Caroline mentioned a number of the books that I've done, and you can see the one on the left is the Wild Berries of BC.